Morning, I sat in the parking lot of a Walgreens on Route 9 and ate a gas station sandwich for breakfast. Cold. The bread was already getting stiff at the edges. I was 61 years old. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I wasn't some guy who never worked, never built anything, never tried. I spent 32 years in commercial roofing. Started as a laborer at 23, hauling materials up ladders in July heat that would drop a younger man. By the time I was 40, I had my own crew. By 50, I had a company, 8 trucks, 22 employees, contracts with 3 school districts, and a hospital network in Central Ohio. My name was on the side of those trucks. My name. The company was called Alderman Roofing. My last name is Alderman. Bernard Alderman. My last name is Alderman. Bernard Alderman. People called me Bernie my whole life, but I always signed documents as Bernard. Felt more serious, more like something that would last. It didn't last. The collapse came fast, the way these things always do. Slowly and then all at once. A bonding company pulled our surety coverage after one of my project managers, a man I'd trusted for 11 years, falsified inspection reports on a school gymnasium job. I didn't know. I should have caught it maybe. But I didn't. By the time the school district's lawyers got involved, the legal fees were eating through everything. I had to let the crew go in waves. First the newest hires, then the veterans. Then it was just me and my office manager, sitting in a building I could no longer afford to lease. We locked the doors in February. I filed Chapter 7 in March. The house. A 4-bedroom colonial I'd owned for 19 years. The house where I raised my son. Went back to the bank in April. My wife, Charlene, had passed 4 years before all this. Ovarian cancer. She was gone in 7 months from diagnosis. I still don't have good words for that. I just don't. So when the bank took the house, it was just me. I put what I could fit into my F-250. Some clothes, Charlene's photo albums, a cast iron skillet she'd had since before we were married. And I drove to my son's house. His name is Drew. He's 34. He lives in a nice neighborhood outside Columbus, one of those developments where every lawn looks identical and there's a pond in the middle, with a fountain that runs all summer. He works in pharmaceutical sales. He married a woman named Kristen about 5 years ago. They have a daughter, my granddaughter, who was 3 at the time. I pulled into his driveway at around 7 in the evening. I remember the sprinklers were running even though it had rained that afternoon. I knocked on the door. Drew answered. He looked at my truck, at the bags visible through the window, and something in his face shifted, just slightly. I told him what had happened. The full version. He listened with his arms crossed. He said, "Dad, this isn't really a good time." I thought he meant that evening. I said, I just needed a couple of weeks to get back on my feet. Find a room to rent somewhere. Figure out next steps. He looked over his shoulder, back into the house, then back at me. He said, "Kristen's not really comfortable with having someone staying here long term. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. I still don't. I said, "Drew, I have nowhere to go." He said he was sorry about that. He said maybe I could look into the extended stay on 270. He said he'd help with the first week if I needed it, and I could hear Kristen somewhere in the background asking who was at the door. He didn't answer her. He just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between pity and inconvenience, and I understood that I was the inconvenience. I told him not to worry about the money. I backed out of that driveway and I drove to the Meijer on Broad Street, and I sat in that parking lot until 11 o'clock at night, because I didn't know where else to go. I finally drove to a park-and-ride lot off I-70, reclined my seat, and that's where I slept. 61 years old, built something from nothing, watched it fall apart, slept in my truck. The call came on a Tuesday. I was at the library. I'd been using their Wi-Fi to search for warehouse work, anything really, I wasn't particular, when my cell rang with an unfamiliar Columbus number. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. A man who introduced himself as Philip Morse, personal assistant to a man named Conrad Whitfield. He asked if I was Bernard Alderman. I said I was. He said Mr. Whitfield would like to meet with me at my earliest convenience, and that he was prepared to offer me $250 for 1 hour of my time. I said, I'm sorry, who is Conrad Whitfield? Philip Morse said, he's the founder of Whitfield Capital Group. I knew the name. Anyone in Ohio construction knew it. Conrad Whitfield had started as a real estate developer in the 80s, branched into infrastructure financing, and by the late 90s he built one of the largest private equity firms in the Midwest. He was in his late 70s now. Reclusive. I'd never met him. I couldn't imagine why he'd be calling me. I said, why does he want to meet with me? Philip Morse said, he'll explain that himself. He'd prefer to do it in person. I had nothing to lose. I said yes. The address was a house in Bexley, old money neighborhood, mature trees, no HOA fountains. The house itself was large but not ostentatious. Dark brick. A lot of windows. I rang the bell and Philip Morse answered. Mid-40s, trim, the kind of efficient calm you develop from years of managing someone else's complicated life. He led me through a front hall with hardwood floors and into a sitting room that smelled like old books and whatever wood they use in rooms where serious things happen. Conrad Whitfield was in a chair near the window. He was thinner than I'd expected. Whatever he was fighting, it was winning, but his eyes were sharp, pale gray and completely alert. He said, Mr. Alderman, thank you for coming. Sit down, please. I sat. He said, I imagine you're wondering why I called you. I told him I was. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at me. Then he said, do you remember the night of March 14th, 3 years ago? A Tuesday. On 315 North, just past the Morse Road overpass. I did remember it. I remembered it very well. It had been raining hard that night. I was driving back from a bid meeting that had run late. I saw a car, a dark Mercedes, partially off the road, driver's side against the guardrail. Hazards were on. I almost didn't stop. I almost kept going the way most people do. But I pulled over. The driver was an older man, slumped over the wheel. Not unconscious. He was responsive. But his color was wrong. Grayish. He was pressing one hand against his chest. I called 911 immediately and stayed with him. Kept him talking. Kept him awake. The paramedics said later that he'd had a significant cardiac event and that the delay of even a few more minutes could have been fatal. I didn't know who he was. He hadn't told me. I gave the paramedics my name and phone number in case they needed a statement, and I drove home. I never heard anything back. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. I looked at Conrad Whitfield across that sitting room. He said, that was my car. I didn't say anything for a moment. He said, I've known who you were since that night. I had Philip look into you. I've been following what happened to your company. I know about the bonding issue and the legal situation. I know what the bankruptcy cost you. And I know what happened when you went to your son's house in April. I felt something cold move through me. Not anger exactly. Something more like exposure. The feeling of realizing someone has seen something you thought was private. I asked him how he knew about that. He said, I'd been watching out for you. I felt I owed you that much, at minimum. I had someone keeping an eye on things. He paused. I saw you leave his driveway. I saw where you went after. I should have felt violated, maybe. Instead, I just felt tired. I nodded. He said, I'm dying, Mr. Alderman. Pancreatic cancer. I have perhaps 3 or 4 months. I have no children, no surviving siblings. I spent most of my adult life building something, and I find myself at the end of it asking what exactly I built it for. He looked out the window for a moment. You stayed with a stranger in the rain until help came. You didn't know me. You had somewhere to be. You stayed anyway. That's not nothing. In my experience, it's actually quite rare. I told him I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I told him anyone would have done the same. He smiled slightly and said, You and I both know that isn't true. He told me he'd been working with his attorneys for months. He said he wanted to restructure his estate. He had charitable foundations that would continue. He had long-time employees who'd been provided for, but there was a remaining portion. His personal assets, the house, a portfolio of commercial properties in Franklin County, and his investment accounts, that he wanted to go to someone who demonstrated something he believed in. He said he wanted to leave it to me. I said he wanted to leave it to me. I said, Mr. Whitfield, I can't. He held up one hand. He said, I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I've decided. My attorneys have drawn up the documents. what I'm asking from you. The only thing I'm asking is that you come back next week to meet with them and to understand what you're receiving and what responsibilities, if any, you're choosing to take on. I drove home to the extended stay I'd finally rented with the last of my savings, and I sat on the edge of that bed and I didn't move for a long time. I came back the following Wednesday. The attorneys were professional, thorough, not unkind. They walked me through everything. The commercial properties, 4 buildings, fully leased in Dublin and Westerville, the investment portfolio, the personal accounts, the house in Bexley, which I could sell or keep. The total value was approximately $4.3 million. I know some people might hear a number like that and feel joy right away. I felt something more like vertigo. I kept thinking about my crew, the guys I'd had to let go, the project manager who'd lied and taken everything down with him, Charlene, who wasn't here for any of it. I signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in May. Conrad Whitfield died 11 days later. Philip Morse called to tell me. He said it had been peaceful. The call from Drew came on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after the estate had cleared probate. I don't know exactly how he found out. Small world, I suppose, especially in Columba's real estate circles. He called my cell. I was having coffee on the small patio of the Bexley house. I decided to keep it, at least for a while. The morning was nice. Quiet. He said, "Dad, I heard something. I wanted to reach out. I feel terrible about what happened in April. Kristen and I talked about it, and we both feel like we didn't handle it well." I noticed he said they didn't handle it well. Not that they didn't handle me well. He said, "I think I panicked. I should have stepped up. You're my dad. That's not who I want to be." I let him talk. He said he wanted to get together. Bring the baby. Maybe do dinner. He said, "I think we have some things to work through, you know. But family is family. Family is family." I thought about the night in the park and ride lot, the stiff sandwich at the Walgreens, the look on his face in that doorway, the sprinklers running in the rain. I said, "Drew, I appreciate you calling." He started to say something about Sunday dinner, and I said, "I'm going to stop you there." He was quiet. I said, "I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that. But I've been doing a lot of thinking since April about what matters to me and who I want to spend my time with. And I've realized something. The people in my life who I want to keep in my life, they showed up before any of this, not after." He said, "Dad, come on. I told you I made a mistake." I said, "I know, and I believe that you believe that. But I also know that you knew exactly what you were doing that night. You weren't confused. You weren't overwhelmed. You made a choice." I paused. "I'm making one too." He said, "So that's it? You're just going to cut off your own son?" I said, "I'm going to give you the same thing you gave me that night, a clean exit." I heard him start to say something else, and I said goodbye, and I ended the call. I sat there on Conrad Whitfield's patio. My patio, I still couldn't quite believe it, and I finished my coffee. A robin was working through the edge of the garden. The air smelled like cut grass and whatever those flowering trees are, the ones that only bloom for about 2 weeks in May. Charlene would have known what they were called. She would have told me without me even asking, the way she did with things like that. I missed her. Over the following months, I started to figure out what a life forward actually looked like. I met with a property management firm to handle the commercial buildings. I wasn't going into real estate. I knew my limits, and I knew what I didn't know. But the income from those leases was steady, and the properties were in good shape. It turned out Conrad had been meticulous about maintenance. Of course he had. I reconnected with 2 guys from my old crew, Dwayne and a man everyone called Lefty, whose actual name I'm not sure anyone knew anymore. And we met for breakfast at a Bob Evans on the west side and talked for 3 hours. They'd both landed on their feet. Dwayne was running a maintenance crew for a property company. Lefty had gone back to his brother's painting business. They were good. I was glad. I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at a workforce development center in Franklinton. They worked with men coming out of incarceration, helping them build trade skills. I ran a basic construction literacy workshop on Tuesdays. Measuring, reading blueprints, how to talk to a foreman on the first day. Small things that make a difference. I wasn't doing it to feel good about myself. I was doing it because those mornings were the only ones where I felt like I was still the person I recognized. There was a woman at the center. She ran the administrative side, oversaw all the programming. Her name was June. She was maybe 55, sharp, no patience for nonsense, but a lot of patience for people. We started having coffee after the Tuesday sessions. It wasn't romantic, not at first. It was just two people who'd both built things and lost things, and were figuring out what the next chapter looked like. One morning, she asked me why I'd started coming in. I told her the short version, the company, the bankruptcy, the house. I left out the Bexley part. She listened without performing sympathy, which I appreciated. She said, "And now, where are you now?" I thought about how to answer that. I said, "I'm okay. I think I'm genuinely okay," which is something I wasn't sure I'd be able to say. She nodded. She said, "That's not a small thing." I told her it didn't feel small. I want to say one more thing before I finish telling you this. There's something that happens to a man when he loses everything at 61. Not just the money. The money is almost beside the point, or it becomes beside the point after a while. What you lose is the story you'd been telling yourself about who you are, the narrative that said, "I built something, I provided, I matter." When that's gone, you find out pretty fast who sees you as a person and who only ever saw you as a resource. My son saw me as a resource. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it as a fact. The way you'd acknowledge any fact about the world that took you a long time to accept. Conrad Whitfield saw me as a person. He saw me for 30 minutes in the rain on a highway shoulder when I didn't even know he was looking. That turned out to be enough. I think about that a lot. How the smallest moments are the ones that contain the most of who you actually are. The moment you keep driving. The moment you pull over. The moment you open the door. The moment you don't. I still have the photo albums from Charlene. They're on a shelf in the front hall of the house in Bexley. Sometimes in the morning, when the light comes through the east windows at a certain angle, I look at one of those pictures, her in the backyard of the old house, squinting into the sun, laughing at something I'd apparently said, and I think about how she would have reacted to all of this. She would have had a lot to say about Drew. She would have been heartbroken and furious, and then eventually pragmatic, the way she was about most hard things. And then, probably, she would have said something funny, something that cut right to the center of it in 10 words or less. I still don't know what those words would have been. But I'm still here. I'm still showing up on Tuesday mornings. I'm still drinking bad coffee and teaching men how to read a tape measure and talking too long with June in the parking lot afterward. It's not what I planned. But it's mine. I've thought a lot about the night I pulled over on 315 North. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't, not at the time. It was raining. I was tired. I almost kept driving. Most people would have. Most people would have. Most people did before I stopped. That's the part that stays with me. Not what I did, but how close I came to not doing it. There's no mystical explanation for what happened between that night and the morning Philip Morse called me. No cosmic ledger that was keeping track. What there was, I think, is simply this. Conrad Whitfield was a man who paid attention. He noticed what kind of person stopped and what kind didn't. And when it came time for him to decide who he trusted with what he'd spent a lifetime building, he went back to that night on the highway as his answer. Character isn't invisible. People see it. Sometimes the person seeing it is someone you'll never know mattered. I think about Drew too. I don't spend a lot of time on it anymore, but I think about him. He made a calculation that April night. He weighed his own comfort, or his wife's, or whatever story he needed to tell himself, against his father standing in his driveway with nowhere to go. And he chose comfort. That's not a monstrous thing. It's a human thing, but it's a thing you can't take back. And more importantly, it's a thing that reveals what you actually are when no one's keeping score. He thought no one was keeping score. He was wrong about that too, just not in the way he expected. What I've learned. Slowly, the way you only learn things that cost you something is that integrity isn't the big moments. It isn't the speech you give or the sacrifice you announce. It's the Tuesday night on a wet highway when you're tired and late and nobody would know if you kept going. It's what you do when there's no audience and no reward and no reason except that it's the right thing. I didn't pull over that night because I was trying to be good. I pulled over because I couldn't imagine not doing it. That's the only honest version of the story, and I think that's actually what Conrad saw. Not some grand moral act, but a man who simply couldn't live with himself if he hadn't stopped. That's not heroism. That's just a certain kind of stubbornness about who you're willing to be. The resilience part. The part where I rebuilt after losing everything at 61. That didn't come from optimism. I wasn't optimistic. I was exhausted and angry and more than a little lost. What kept me going was something smaller and less romantic than resilience. It was just the refusal to let the worst chapter be the last one. Every Tuesday morning I showed up at that workforce center in Franklinton. Not because I had it figured out, because showing up was the one thing I could still control. You don't rebuild a life all at once. You rebuild it in small decisions, over and over, until one day you're sitting on a patio you never expected to own, drinking coffee you never expected to afford, and you realize the story turned out different than you planned, and that different turned out to be enough. Bernie Alderman, 61 years old, still here.